Not so long ago, 10 years ago, I didn't know much about slavery at all. The greater amount of my work has been made in 100 and something, not 107 countries around the world documenting humanity. Many people that time has forgotten, and different tribes around the world that are vanishing and changing with modernities and being pushed out and away. And I've done so with this notion of celebrating unity and diversity, because in my mind, well, gosh, what would the world be like if instead of being afraid of one another's differences, instead we had this notion of wonder or curiosity? Like, how would that change relationships between us or relationships between nations? Because of the work I've done, I had been invited to be the sole exhibitor of the World Peace Summit in Vancouver, in Canada, with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and other Nobel laureates. And so I was there showing all of my work, and a supporter of an organization called Free the Slaves walked up to me and said, "Do you know about slavery? Have you ever considered documenting slavery?" And I said, "Well, slavery, what do you mean?" And she said, "You know what you're thinking right now? If you think of what slavery was like, just what you're thinking." It was a very strange moment. I knew there was trafficking, but I thought that trafficking was this little tiny trickle. And she said, "No, 27 million people are held against their will in slavery today." Now, if we advance that number to today, there's almost 46 million people enslaved. So 2 things struck me. One was the obvious: how possibly can there be slavery in the world? I mean, wasn't that taken care of already in the 1800s with Lincoln, right? And the other was, how could I, whose entire occupation and way of being is based on observing others, not have seen it? And then I thought, this terrible, terrible thought, which is, well, if I don't know, how many others don't know? I felt like I'd been hit with a freight train, like just boom, right into me. And I couldn't sleep. I was really agitated and so concerned. I can't explain how disquieting it was. So within a couple weeks, I got an air ticket and I flew down to Los Angeles, where I met with the co-founder and then executive director of Free the Slaves. And I offered up my help because I had this idea. And I believe all of us, each one of us in this room, has a gift, and mine has always been connecting with people and making images of people. And I knew that if I could make an intimate, stirring image of a human being, no matter how dire their circumstance or the environment in which they're forced to survive, that I could house their dignity, or not house it, but rather show what they house in themselves, and that viewers could stand before an image and be moved by it and want to raise a hand to help. So that's sort of how my journey began into documenting slavery. And the interesting thing is that almost every place that I went, I had been before. Some even of those countries I considered like a second home to myself, because I'd been to them so many times. And this time I would go back and I would see the skeletons in the closet. So what I'm going to share with you this evening is my journey, and I'm sharing it in such a way that it shows you the different forced labors that I have encountered in little bits, or most of the ones that I encountered. And I'll explain really what it was like for me to witness these atrocities, and to share with you what I've learned. So I was first introduced to the brick kilns in India and Nepal. When I think back on it, it was really like walking into what I imagined ancient Egypt to be, or like Dante's Inferno, where men and women and children stacked bricks on their heads, up to 18 at a time, each brick weighing more than 4 pounds. You can't imagine seeing people so covered and cloaked in this dust that they had to continually keep stacking these bricks, walk to trucks 100 or so yards away, take them off their heads, put them down, walk back in, and do the same thing. Now, because entire families were enslaved, the ones that were too young to work were left to their own devices. And they were frightened, obviously, in the kiln with all the debris flying around and people and commotion and threats coming from the slaveholders and managers. The brick kilns are, if you can imagine a kiln, which you see here on the left-hand side, that's the Great Tower. But the kiln is actually surrounding that Great Tower. And each segment it's cut in quarters. If you can see a pie from an aerial view, the kiln is created in quarters. And bricks that are taken in wet clay form are pressed into a mold and then laid out in the sun to dry for about a week. So they become like this light brown clay. But then they're brought into the kiln where they're stacked upon layer, and then covered over with sand. And the coal is placed in the earth from the kiln, and it cooks them. And it cooks for about a week, and then it becomes this very orange color. This is how it looks prior. And he's a brick maker. Now, there's elders also that are forced to work in the brick kilns. I have to tell you that when I first was introduced to slavery, it was, as I mentioned, the brick kilns. But I remember seeing these elders stacking the bricks, and I can't explain what it was like to see them gone. It's as though they'd gone mechanical. They just sort of would walk and stack and walk, and there was this hypnotic feeling about them. And I remember that it was really early on when I started documenting, and I burst out crying. I just had these tears just start pouring down my face. And the abolitionist that I was with grabbed me by my shoulder and shook me, and he said, "Stop, you cannot do that here. This is not safe for you, and it is not safe for them." And I remember in that moment having a real reckoning with why I was there, and I was there to bear witness, and I was there to prove that this was existing. But I wasn't there to interrupt or intrude. And I had to really put a lot of trust in the partners that I was working with on the ground that were really fighting slavery. And indeed, they are the actual experts to liberate people. In fact, I should say that before I went into the field, I was given very strict instructions that I was not allowed to help anyone. I couldn't give anyone money. I couldn't offer them promises. I couldn't offer them hope. All I could do was bear witness to them, not interrupt them in their work, and just be present with them in that regard. And I remember that all of my sorrow, because I had seen so much sorrow, come up when I was back home in my studio. And I would be editing till like 2 or 3 in the morning and just crying and streaming tears. Of course, these individuals are forced to work. We're not talking like 8 hours a day. It's like 16 to 18 hours a day, every day, every day. And there's all this dust falling around them so that they're inhaling it. And they're obviously subject to environmental illnesses from breathing all this in, the dust, and they frequently get sick. They get silicosis, and they get tuberculosis, and they have no medical option. They're not able to go to a doctor. They're not able to be treated. Many of them obviously die of this illness. And they're easily replaceable. They just go pluck more people to fill their positions. Here you can see the grave amount of bricks that these people are carrying through the kilns. It was so hot. In fact, when I was in there with my partners, the abolitionists, whom I have such enormous respect for, they are my guardians, my translators, my guides, my safety. It was 130 degrees Fahrenheit on some of these days. 130 degrees Fahrenheit. You know, The abolitionists, of which there was usually about 5, and one would be directly beside me, and there would be others that would be on the perimeters of anywhere that we were making images. And they were there in order that if a slaveholder or a trafficker or a manager was coming near the site, they would alert me and we would all very quickly take off. But those abolitionists on those days were vomiting and fainting because of the heat. These people with this 130-degree heat. And then I think about these people that are enslaved, suffering so. My camera became so hot that I couldn't even touch it. It was so hot I couldn't touch it, and then it just failed to work altogether. So I would have to run back to our cruiser, have the driver put on the car and the air conditioner, and hold my camera under the air conditioner to cool it again so that it would function. And I thought, my gosh, these people are receiving no treatment. My camera gets better treatment than these people. This, to me, is depicts the endlessness of the task. Stacking the bricks, unstacking the bricks, setting up walls of bricks that then will be dismantled and put into trucks and brought to other locations where then they can be sold into the marketplace. On Lake Volta in Ghana, there are tens of thousands of children that are enslaved in the fishing industry. Lake Volta is the largest man-made lake in the world, I believe, or maybe the second largest. And because of this, there's a lot of tree limbs that grow from beneath. And the people have fishing villages, of course, around the whole outskirts, and the children are forced to work on the water. When I first got there, we got out of the cruiser, and I wanted to have a look at the lake and just see what was going on there. And so I was with the abolitionists, and I was standing at the lake's edge, and I saw this. And I said, oh, I see that, the families are still out there fishing. Now, he said, no, Lisa, it's not a family. Those aren't brothers and cousins fishing. Those are all people that are enslaved. And I think it was there that I really recognized that slavery is hidden in plain sight. I believe, through what I do, that the first keystone and foundation to fighting slavery is awareness. It's developing awareness. And it's interesting because awareness on its own won't do anything. We can all be aware and do nothing. But the other truth is that we can do nothing unless we are aware. And I think slavery can be hidden like right in front of you. You can be in a restaurant being served by people, thinking they're getting paid, giving them a tip, and it may be at the end of the day that they're locked down in the basement, even here in America. Slavery could look like a family fishing on a lake. I met these children at 5 in the morning. They had been on the lake's edge fishing with these nets since 1 a.m. They did not finish until 7. They have loads of these young kids, and they toss those nets out into the water. When they're full up, they weigh near 1,000 pounds when those nets are full, and they have all these children, and then older, kind of more like teens, that had been enslaved when they were young and now manage the younger ones. This young man is a manager now. He was enslaved when he was young, treated rather harshly. And then he passes that on to the young boys that he is now responsible for managing. Because these young people are submerged so frequently in the water, they develop a lot of skin ailments, funguses and skin diseases. You see them with scaly hands and ankles and feet, and sometimes on the backs and torso too. How do these kids end up on a lake as enslaved people? A lot of people are enslaved. Well, first of all, everyone is enslaved, not because they're not smart, it's because they've been lied to. In Ghana, there's a lot of families that can't feed their children. And traffickers are very keen, they're ingenious, and they go to these families and say, I really care about your children, and if I have this relative who lives in a different city where they can provide your child schooling and guardianship, and all they have to do is help out a little bit around the house. And so a parent wanting the best for their children says, please, I want my child to have a good life. Please take my child. And the minute that trafficker, assuming themselves as a hero, gets them out of the village, they are vanished. And then they are sold. And then they are trafficked hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away, in this case, to Lake Volta. Now, they love kids there. Mostly it's children that are enslaved on Lake Volta, tens of thousands, as I mentioned. And they love the children because they have small, nimble fingers and they can pull debris out of the nets, untangle them, tie them back up. But the strange thing is that they're forced to work on that lake, and not one of them has been taught how to swim. Now you see this kid, he's on a tiny, narrow canoe, a canoe clearly only big enough for him, and he's in the middle of this lake that is very much like an ocean. It's huge, it gets turbulent, and he's in the boat by himself. And I don't know if you can see that he has a tear going down his face because we were on a larger boat, of course, and the boatman was going to see this young child, and we had translators and everything, but the boatman wasn't quite keen with his brakes, and so our big boat went over the hood of his little canoe, and the canoe rose out of the ground in the back, out of the water in the back, and this kid just obviously started screaming and crying, and he was so petrified. So I was holding onto his boat and then having our boatman back off it. It was obviously an accident, but it just petrified him. And all I could think of is how this child does not know how to swim, and he's so afraid. Little girls as well. When I was out in the villages and I was meeting the children on the lake and in the villages, every single kid I met knew another child that has drowned. And I can only think, what would it be like to be that small person who was taken from their family, like literally just stolen away from their family and trafficked to lands that they don't know, areas they don't know, dialects they don't know, forced to slave on the lake when they don't even know how to swim, and they know other children that have drowned. How petrifying that would be. This is Kofi. I love Kofi. He was rescued. In situations in which children are enslaved, they frequently rescue people. Rescuing is not always the best way to bring people out of slavery, but with children, it's always the best way. So they go in and they'll rescue a bunch of children at once out of a fishing village, and this was made in a shelter just outside of Lake Volta. And the shelters are made, obviously, to take the children in, but it's really to rehumanize them. It's really to give them the space and time and the support to learn what it is to be a child, again, to laugh and to play and to be relaxed. This image was made behind the shelter where little Kofi was bathing. He had a well, and there was a big bucket, and he would take this bucket and fill it up with water and pour it over his head. And when I look at him, I see every kid in the world in him. And I think to me, it's a really iconic image because when I returned home, it was about a year later after I made this image, and I got news that the partners of Free the Slaves, Challenging Heights in Ghana, had actually located this boy's family. And so as we sit and speak today, he's been brought back together with his actual family. And what's even better is his family was given skills to learn how to make a better living, and they're able to feed their children more. And they were also given another type of skill, which is to reckon with how to understand what a trafficker is, because traffickers are cunning and they lie very well. In the Himalayas, I witnessed young children carrying stone that weighs more than they do. This, by the way, this is slate. And all I could think of when I saw this was, wow, is that the slate I have in my bathroom? All that tile? Because each of us in this room right now is unknowingly participating in slavery. It's, through the things we purchase, the clothes we wear, the food we eat, the phones we speak on, the computers. Slavery is in so many supply chains. In a shirt that we have, there's the cotton from the shirt, there's the dyers of the shirt, where are the buttons made, where are the labels made? What building are those things made in? Was that made in a building that was made from the bricks that were from that brick kiln where people were enslaved? Like, it's this endless labyrinth of where slavery exists in the supply chain, and it's only now that we're being able to measure it and look into corporations and for them to kind of excavate and pull out the more dangerous parts, but it's going to take a long time. So these boys, you can see that the stone is tethered to their head that weight, and it takes a lot of those kids to lift it up and put it on their backs. Now, these boys are brothers, and they're holding hands in order to stabilize one another when they go down the precarious Himalayan range in Nepal to trucks below. I'm pretty tough. I'm a pretty strong chick. I could not lift these stones. I couldn't lift them an inch off the ground by myself. So these children, whom ought to be in school, are not. And so for like 10, 12 hours a day, all they do is carry these down the mountain and then come up and get another stone. So these gals, they're my heroes. This is another wonderful positive tale. You know, back in the time of the transatlantic slave trade, a person who was purchased as a quote-unquote slave could be purchased for about the annual salary of what a businessman would make then. So say it's equivalent of around $50,000 to purchase a person whom one enslaves. Well, nowadays, it's cheap. I mean, you can enslave an entire family for like $18, $20 for generations in some countries. There's whole communities, whole villages in India, Pakistan, where entire villages are enslaved for generations. Now, they don't even know they're enslaved because it's all they've ever known. This particular village is enslaved in quarrying. So their whole occupation is to be in a quarry, break down stone into littler stones and smaller stones and little teeny stones and into gravel that perhaps we have in our driveway, right, or a garden. Now, with the help of partners of Free the Slaves who work internally to liberate people as opposed to rescue them, and I'll give you a little notion as to how that works. The abolitionists that I work with are working undercover, right? So they go in and they befriend these people and they say, hey, would you like to come have tea tomorrow afternoon? Maybe come have dinner at my house? Oh, no, I'm working. Well, how about Friday? How about Friday night after work? Oh, no, I'm working. Well, maybe on the weekend, Saturday or Sunday. No, I'm working. Well, you really must love your job. You must. I mean, how much do you get paid? And so it sounds kind of silly, but there's this reckoning with paid. Why don't I have time off? And there starts to be this infusing idea that indeed they're missing rights that other people have. And they work diligently with these people undercover for like 3 years before they can get people out. Now, this particular village, they knew by I think 2 years in that they were in fact enslaved and that they had rights that they weren't receiving and they were getting direly treated. So at one point, the whole village left their township, their village, to go meet with an attorney, and it was, I don't know, it was a long ways away. They used trucks to get them there. Now, when they returned to their village, their entire village was burnt to the ground. The slaveholders had burnt everything they had. They had nothing, by the way. They only had this meek shelter and maybe an extra sari per 10 families. I mean, they had so little. And so they all wanted to give up because they were petrified. I mean, what's next? They'll kill us, which is true. They could kill them. But this woman in the middle, this woman, who's my hero, said, no, we cannot turn back. We cannot give up now. We have lost everything. What more really do we have to lose? Even if some of us die, our children will have better hope. And she rallied, and she got the whole village to continue on. And then we fast forward a bit, and with the help of these organizations, they got a lease to their own quarry. They still do the same backbreaking work, by the way, but they do it in freedom and they get paid for it. And you can see just by looking at them that they're clean, that they have they have empowerment. They decide how many hours they want to work, and their children all go to school. They have these community schools. It's just an amazing, beautiful story of hope. When I was in Ghana, I documented in illegal gold mines. Now, I like to start this story with how it happens, going back to that in this particular circumstance. If you can imagine the Wild West, when people would go out west and they would want to make their fortune in gold, it's kind of like that. People will, use all the money they have and go to this area known as Ashanti because people know that there are gold minings there, legal gold mining, and they want to work in them. So they use all that they have to arrive to this place, and when they arrive, they suddenly are told, oh, you can't have a job because you're not licensed. You don't have the skill set and the licensing to work in these mines. So now they've spent all the money, they have nothing left, and they're stuck. So again, that's when the conniving trafficker comes in and says, oh, I could lend you money. Here, take this, take care of your family. And not only that, you can work for me. So what those traffickers do, and those money lenders, is they bring them to a slaveholder who has illegal mines. So the mines that have been abandoned, the illegal trade will take over. And all these people are in indebted bondage because they have taken a loan, and the interest rates on the loan are so high, they're like 50%. They can never pay it back. That loan only grows, that debt only grows, and then their children inherit it when they pass on, and this is how it happens. Now, in this particular case, this is like a vertical mine shaft, and it goes down hundreds of feet. Because it's illegal, it's not aerated, there's no air. There's no lighting, there's no electricity, it's just a deep, dark hole. And these guys go down there. You see that it's held up with these tree limbs. That's the only thing holding up those mines, and they collapse all the time. They are given an empty sack, primitive tools like a couple hammers, and a flashlight, like a cheap flashlight that's tethered to their heads with this elastic band that's very tattered. And the lights don't always work, believe me. When I went down into those mines, I went down 300 feet. This was made at 200 feet, I was told. And because I don't use any flash, I had asked the people that I was with, there was 5 men that were enslaved that brought me down. The abolitionists would not go down that hole with me. So they brought me down. And I asked them if they'd be so kind, one of them spoke English, if they could remove their headlamps and shine it on this gentleman's face so that I could have enough light to make an exposure. Now this image, for some reason it's endearing, as they all are to me, but he happened to be my age. I made that image when I was 44, and he was 44. And I don't think he's alive today. I can't tell you the amount of people that go down those shafts. They're meant to remain down there 48, 72 hours at a time. The earth inside is really hot, and it's super wet. It's very moist. In fact, this fellow had just come out of the shaft, and you could see how sweaty he is from the earth. But when they come out of that shaft, you can see them coming out here, that their clothes look like they've come out of a pool, you know? They're coming out, imagine 48, 72 hours, with a heavy bag now full of stone that has gold in it, their tools, and they're climbing up the shaft that is wet. The limbs are super slippery. I mean, I even lost my grip at one point. I was so petrified, and all I had was a camera shucked around my back with a strap. And I had met a fellow a few days before who had fallen, and he was so broken apart, it was super sad, but people fall to their death often there. And this is a group of miners, again, that have just come out of the shaft, and you can see that they're, again, soaking wet, and you see that their eyes are yellowed from the darkness and all the tremendous dust from pounding away. So once they come up with those stones, the stones are then transported to what they call a pounding site. This is a pounding site. So now this part is where they take those big stones, they put them in the pans here, and they have these huge metal bars, really heavy, and all these guys do is pound. They pound all day, again, up to 16, 18 hours a day. Now they are just surrounded with an enormous amount of dust, also causing silicosis and tuberculosis. So you can have a fellow like this who clearly is so strong, he's like an Adonis, and within a year or two, he could be melted down to skin and bones. These people often pass away from the severity of their situation, usually lung disease. And again, they are just easily replaced. Children are also enslaved in this. You can see here this boy is pounding, and you could see the stone and the gold on his hands. The children are working there as long as they're able to carry anything or do anything, they will force them to work. This is another type of pounding, not pounding site, but gold mining that's done in the water. And so this is in a different area near a river. And they excavate the water from the river to go into these gushing holes that are actually made from machines. And then the people go in and they, just like in the old days, they're panning for gold. This particular area, you'll see women, and the women have the babies strapped to the back. And they're in there sifting the gold. Now, the problem is that they use mercury in the extraction process because the mercury separates the gold from the debris and the dust and everything in the water. So because it's so loosely set out, it's actually quite expensive, but obviously it falls into the water. They are, working in these waters with their children on their back and feeding their children in this mercury poisoned, liquid. It's crazy. Children set inside the pans, just sitting by the water as the women work. I think textiles is something that we are all readily knowing of when it comes to slavery. That and sex trafficking, I think, is the most common thing that we've known about. This image is touching to me because I call it a family portrait. The father's hands are the black hands, and his two sons are the red and the blue hands. Now, this whole family is enslaved in silk dyeing, so they take these big bushels of raw silk, just white, and they put them into these great barrels of a certain color, as you can see. And they go into about their elbows to bring this, to submerge the silk into the dye. And the problem is, of course, that the dye is often toxic, right? So these people who are working all day are poisoning themselves, and they're not paid. And in this case, too, this particular family was on their way to being liberated. So they had said to me, which was quite hopeful, really, but they said, we know we have this skill, and we look forward to the day that we can use our skill to actually earn money. And I thought that was so profound that, some people are enslaved and they can't even, that window of possibility would be utterly absent. But with them, these people are now free. This is carpet weaving. This gentleman had become enslaved over 20 years ago over a debt of like $15 or $20. I suppose because sex trafficking is one of those, like the textiles, where it's so widely known, and because it has that strong taboo yet ancient historical notion, I felt like this would be the most dangerous area for me to work in, and indeed it is. When I was in Nepal, I was escorted by women that used to be enslaved in sex trafficking, and they brought me into these brothels. Now, in Nepal, the brothels aren't brothels per se. They're known as cabin restaurants. And so these are sort of these dingy, dark restaurants that are often underground, like in Kathmandu. And so they're not easy to see, but you go down inside them, and there's women that work in these various rooms. So each of these rooms, you can see that they're separated by wood paneling and have little curtains. And each of the rooms has a table and a tiny mat inside and a number on the wall. So the women, and there were women working there, but there were also children. I mean, like 12-year-old children, 7-year-old children, girls and boys that are forced to work in there. Now, their job, of course, is to encourage their customers to buy more beer and alcohol and more food. But the notion of a cabin restaurant is really like a brothel. So the customers are allowed to do whatever they wish with the people that work here. So these women and young children endure grave sexual abuse from the customers of these establishments. Now we're in India. Back to communities of enslavement. India has an area called Sonagachi, which is in Calcutta, and it's certainly the largest brothel in all of Asia. It's a huge community of a brothel area. Many of the people there have been trafficked, often from Nepal, but from other areas, other countries surrounding as well, and brought here. Sonagachi is kind of like a small borough, if you will, within Calcutta. And once you walk in, you just see tons of girls and women lined up on the street in their saris, just sort of hanging out, but all of them are for sale. It was very dangerous, again, for me to work in this area, and I had a fellow who I'll never disclose his name, who lived there. And so he brought me into this area, and we had a deal. You know, I had to have my gear always in my pack, never visible, obviously. And I had to go with him, but I had to follow him like 20, 30 paces back, because in no way could he be associated with me. If anybody's found with a camera or making images there, you'd just be killed and beaten or killed. And so I would follow him, and it was really difficult because this is a packed area full of women and girls standing, but also buyers, like tons of men walking around. It's like a thick, like a bazaar, really, like full of people. And I would have to see this young man and follow his wake, and then he would dash up into a building, and I would then follow him, and I'd meet him at the top, like on the roof. And that is where this image was made, looking down. So the women that you see there obviously are enslaved, and it's not that you would notice that, right? They don't look exactly like they're forced prostitutes, right? They look like fine Indian women, maybe with a little more lipstick. But it's astonishing how many people are there. And again, there I suppose it's not hidden in plain sight in that it's in an area that's very well known for being a brothel, and there's tens of thousands of girls and women that are enslaved in that area for sex trafficking. This was made inside of one of the brothels. I spent a lot of time in the brothels with these same people over and over again before I would ever bring a camera out. And I always worked with permission. Interestingly, elders in Sonagachi are for sale too. So if one has been selling sex, forcibly selling their body all of these years, it doesn't end. Even as an elder, they continue to have to sell themselves. This woman, it's a tragic story, but I made this image, and I went home, and the young man who had brought me in emailed me a couple months after, and he told me that she was found in the gutter outside of the brothel dead. And he was vehement, obviously because she had passed and because she had been harmed, and that is why she passed, but because none of the police did a thing about it. They didn't even bother looking into it, because you see, they don't even matter. And it's really heartbreaking how communities such as this, and everywhere in the world, certain communities are totally overlooked. So I think it's mentioned that I've done my work in many countries around the world, but in fact, I had never done a project in the United States. And I did my first one in Washington, D.C., documenting the sex trade, because when I had first come out with my work, I was showing it, and because they were all from foreign countries, and I was showing it in the United States, a frequent comment would be, well, of course that happens in other countries. You know those countries. There would be a lot of judgment. And I just felt like, my goodness, it happens everywhere. Do you know that slavery is illegal in virtually every country in the world? And yet it exists in pretty much every country in the world. In the United States alone, the New York Times reported that between 100,000 and 300,000 US-born children, minors, are sold into sex slavery annually. And I think it's important that we embrace our own wounds, that we note that this happens, as we all know, in Omaha, right? It happens all over the United States. When I was in DC, this is Tina Front. She's this astonishing heroine. She now runs a place in Washington, D.C. called Courtney's House. And she risks her life and goes out into the street, and she rescues young minors that have been trafficked. So they come and they stay in Courtney's house, and it's very safe and it's quiet, and they do a lot to support these young people. However, sadly, because such horror has happened to these girls, so many times raped and abused, and the hot ticket on the street is 14 years old, so these kids are kids. And they endure such darkness when they go to sleep, so many nightmares, reliving this horror that's already happened to them, that they will actually try to escape out of the Courtney's house, and they do so successfully, and they will go back to the very place that they were initially trafficked. So when we think about, liberating people, them liberating themselves is a better way of saying it. We have to know that the sustainability is dire, especially in the sex trade, where people have been so abused. And though it has never been their fault, they house this deep shame. And again, the violence that have been done to them. It's so sad. Interestingly, the church in Washington, D.C. had been the one to give her this particular house, this property for her to have Courtney's house in. And we made this portrait outside, and I love that it says, "You are standing on holy ground. Please respect God's property." This is Holly Smith. Holly's another wonderful friend of mine who's an amazing abolitionist. She was trafficked from a middle America shopping mall when she was 14. She was out with her friends. She wasn't alone. She was with all her friends, and like many people that were 14 and 13, one goes through self-doubts and, coming of age, and I'm not pretty, and whatever we do as girls, right? And she noticed this fellow that kept paying attention to her. And he was a little older. He was really well-dressed. He was quite handsome. And she kept thinking, she could kind of tell, like, she didn't know something was a little wrong, but I think she said she was so, bowled over that this man was paying attention to her instead of her friends, who she thought were really beautiful, and she didn't see herself as beautiful. And so at some point, she was with her friends for, a few hours, bopping around the mall, and finally he called her over, and she went. And all they did was exchange a phone number. That's it. And so from then on, a person would call her, this guy would call her, every other day, spend an hour or two on the phone with her, listening to her dreams, her problems, her fears, her desires, what she wanted to do with her life. So it was interesting because later she learned that the man that she had met in the shopping mall was actually not the person that called her on a regular basis, because that was another job. That was the job of creating trust. So you have what is called a recruiter, you have a trust maker, you have a trafficker, then you have the slaveholder, you have the pimp, right? And at some point, she had enough trust with this fellow, and she was having major issues at home with her parents. Typical kid, by the way, just a typical kid. And she went to meet him. She wanted to go away to go to a nightclub with him, because he said, "Oh, I'm going to introduce you to my wonderful friends and get you in music videos." Just typical things that a liar would say. And she went, and within 5 hours, he had trafficked her over state lines into Atlantic City and had her sold 5 times, starting 5 hours later. Now, she actually was arrested. When these girls are, trafficked, they're actually told, that they can't give their name, they can't give their real age. They tell them they threaten them that if they tell the truth about what's happened to them, that they will kill their family. So in a lot of these situations, in fact, in almost every enslaved situation, no matter what the forced labor, the threats are grave, and they're usually against other family members. So you don't need to chain to tether someone. You just need to touch that place in the head and the heart with fear. In any case, she at one point was arrested, and I think she saw it as her last vestige of hope, and she said the truth. Now, the policeman didn't believe her. He brought her to the station. She was, at that point, of course, her hair was dyed. She had tons of makeup on. She had a tiny dress, a little skirt, high heels, something she would never wear. And they actually handcuffed her to the bench in the like waiting area, because she was very young. She was only 14. And her parents came to get her. And she told her parents what happened, and of course, they didn't believe her. They didn't believe her. They thought, oh, she'd made this decision. It got her into a bad place, and she chose this, and she must be on drugs. And she said, no, this is what happened again. Like a week later, they sent her to a psychologist. She wouldn't drop the story, so they put her in an insane asylum, and they treated her there. Now, I think one thing to notice, like when I was working undercover in Washington, D.C., is even myself, who has spent a large amount of time documenting people, when I was out on those streets in the morning in D.C., the people on the streets, I just had this knee-jerk assumption that these people were entrepreneurs, they were prostitutes, but on their own accord, you know? But then I learned that like more than 90% of them are trafficked. And people aren't there. I mean, nobody grows up and says, oh, I want to be a prostitute, but we all know decisions can lead to bad or poor roads and difficult lives. But most people out there have no control over their lives. None. When I was going to do this work in Washington, D.C., we left, I think, at 4 a.m. to arrive down in downtown D.C. So the roads, the highways were desolate. Nobody was out. All of D.C. was quiet. We arrived to K Street, which is at the embassy, the foot of the embassies, and it was bumper-to-bumper traffic. All buyers. And you know, the buyers were the guy next door in the Subaru with the 3 kids and the wife and the picket fence. And they're so organized out there. I think that was what was so frightening, as I saw traffickers literally cowering over people, abusing them and screaming at them, so that a police car would certainly come by and stop and they'd unroll the window. And I mean, this is enormously, just a lot of profanity. And the policeman would stay for like 10 seconds, roll up the window, and just drive away. And I think that petrified me the most. That, you know, they're bought up in it. They're like part of it. It was so scary. And on the streets, they have the traffickers, but then they have watchers, and the watchers are on bicycles, and they're on all the perimeters of the streets in which the women are forced to sell themselves. And the watchers are looking out for people like me, that, what is that person doing here? What are they doing? Like they're looking out for everything. There's other people that watch the transaction of money. But now, in our modern age, a lot of the payment is done through PayPal, which prevents a lot of arrests. I do this work because I want to shine a light on slavery. I did 2 things in the field. One was I would go out and I would document people in their forced labors, the different forced labors, but I always brought with me this bundle of candles. And when it was safe for them, and it was safe for me, I made these portraits. And I'd have my translator, as always, say what I was doing. So they knew that other people would be seeing these images, people like you. And I told them that we would do all we could do to help them in their plight. I feel like the Shine a Light series is really bringing attention to these individuals. Some of them are still enslaved, and some of them are liberated now. But there isn't a day that goes by that I don't think of these fine people that I've honestly had the great privilege of meeting. They have had such an impact on me. I like to say the truth, which is these people are not my subjects, they are my mentors, and they're my heroes. And a lot of the people that we've seen in these images, some of them are dead now. Some of them are liberated now, and some of them remain still enslaved in the world. In any case, thank you for listening, and thank you.